Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Good morning. Welcome to this public meeting of the Charter Revision Commission. My name is Richard Bury. I have the honor to serve as the chair of this commission. Our purpose is to look at ways to make the city government more responsive, more transparent, and more effective through the tool of the city charter, our city's governing document. One of our primary focus has been to see how we can address the housing crisis through the tool of the city charter. As everybody here knows, we face as a city truly a housing crisis. The status quo is not working. It is clearly time to do something different. And one of our primary focus has been to make sure that we think about what ways the city charter can be amended to help that become possible, to make it easier to build more housing for more New Yorkers. Over the past several months, we've had the honor of hearing from New Yorkers across the 5 boroughs on the issue of affordable housing, but also on many other issues, ranging from expanding our democracy to ensuring that our nonprofit partners who provide vital services are paid on time for their work. And I know I can speak for all of our commissioners, my fellow commissioners, when I say that we've taken all of our testimony that we've received very seriously. We've read through numbers of written reports. I want to express my gratitude to every New Yorker who has come forward, either in writing or in person, to share what they've learned with us. We appreciate it. One thing I want to note is that this commission, though appointed by the mayor, is an independent commission, which means that our recommendations that we will ultimately make to the city voters is bound by our judgment and our expertise. We will pursue ideas regardless of who proposed them and regardless of who supports them. Earlier this month, the commission staff, led by our executive director, Alex Scherenbeck, put together this preliminary report. This preliminary report really reflects a summary of what we've heard so far, the staff's broad ideas about how to address some of the issues that we are facing based on the expert testimony we received. And this hearing is really an opportunity for the commission to engage with the staff as a group on those topics, to hear about the recommendations, to ask questions, to give our feedback as we work towards finalizing our recommendations to the voters. This is a public meeting. I'll remind our commissioners that this is a public meeting. Everything that is discussed is a matter of public record. And although we are not hearing testimony in this meeting, we are, of course, hopefully have folks who are listening in and hearing about our progress in these conversations. The next public hearing of the commission, where we will be receiving testimony, will be in the Great Borough of Brooklyn at Medgar Evers College on May 19th on a Monday. You can find more details on that in future hearings, including how to submit testimony, whether written or otherwise, at nyc.gov/charter. That is nyc.gov/charter. We are joined here by many of our co-commissioners, Vice Chair Sharon Greenberger, Grace Bonilla, Anthony Richardson, Shams DeBaron, Carl Weisbrod, Anita Laramont, Diane Savino, Layla Borzog, Julie's not here, and Catherine Wild are here with us today. So we're going to hear a presentation from Alec about what's in the report. Again, the commission will have time to engage and ask questions, and from there, we will move forward. Thank you, Alec.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here this morning to talk to you a little bit in detail about the preliminary report, which was the staff's effort to distill the very thoughtful testimony that this commission has heard over 16 hours of in-person testimony over hearings in every borough. And as a result of over 400 written comments, some of which are quite detailed and thoughtful, and some of which propose specific amendments to the charter that the commission can continue to consider. As you know, the charter is our city's foundational governing document. It is the city's constitution, and it's been amended many times in the past, often in response to the emergence of new issues. Time can reveal that changes to the charter are necessary, and that was certainly true in 1936. You see here a cartoon asking to throw out the anachronistic, old, archaic city government charter. I don't think any idea in this report suggests throwing out the charter altogether, much much different actually. But it's part of our city's history to take a hard look at the charter over time. Next slide, please. Now, we were formed in December, and we've held our public hearings through the prior months. We just released our preliminary report at the end of April. And if this commission does decide to put questions on the ballot in November, it will conclude its work in July. We've announced 5 more public hearings, 1 in each borough. Virtual testimony is available, and to conclude our work, and more meetings and hearings may be scheduled in the future. Next slide, please. Well, one thing that we've heard overwhelmingly from New Yorkers is that we face an affordability crisis that is maybe the worst in our city's history. And New Yorkers certainly feel the effects every day as longtime New Yorkers are pushed out of neighborhoods they grew up in, and families crowd together in apartments that are far too small. And one small setback can put working families on the edge of eviction or into shelter. This crisis affects what kind of city New York will be and who it will be for. And so there's certainly no more pressing issue for this commission to look at. The crisis affects where we live. And although we don't like to talk about it too much as a very progressive city, New York City's metropolitan area remains one of the most segregated in the country by race and ethnicity, more segregated even than Birmingham, Alabama, and St. Louis by some measures. Our crisis affects the dynamism of our economy and our culture. It affects our heft and presence on the national stage. New York City, I should say New York State, is slated by some estimates to lose 2 further congressional seats in the next congressional redistricting because we are growing more slowly than the rest of the country. And so our ability to have a presence and to shape what happens in Washington, which certainly influences what happens here, is put in jeopardy by our failure to grow and plan for growth. Next slide, please. At the core of this crisis is our inability, our incapacity to build enough housing to keep up with New Yorkers' needs. We are producing far less housing than we used to. And we have long known that our failure to produce enough housing is at the core of our housing affordability crisis. Since 1960, New York City has been in a declared housing emergency, which is defined by not having enough vacancy rate below 5%. And today it is 1.4%, among the lowest it has been since that emergency was declared. And if there's maybe one thing we've heard more than anything else at our hearings, it is that although we have a housing emergency, we are not always treating it like one. Next slide, please. We're also producing less housing than the other parts of the country that are staying more affordable. There's a consistent finding across the country that the cities that are doing the best to control housing costs are the ones that are growing the most. And our own history shows that we can grow more, and that if we do, we're likely to hold costs down more effectively. Next slide. Now, what is at the root of our failure to build? Well, a large component of it is that we've simply just made it illegal to build more housing. In 1961, the city made a major overhaul of the zoning code that in one fell swoop made it illegal in much of the city to build the kind of modest multifamily apartment buildings that define New York's outer borough neighborhoods. And in the decades that followed, we made it harder and harder to build. In the past decade, now just 12 community districts added as much housing as the other 47 combined. We see thus an inequitable share of growth, with some neighborhoods seeing transformative changes, while others grow barely at all. And the districts that are adding the most housing are disproportionately Black and brown, while the districts that are adding the least housing are disproportionately white. Next slide, please. The human consequences of our housing shortage are clear: high rents, displacement, segregation, homelessness, tenant harassment. All of these are the consequences of what you might call a landlord's market, in which landlords hold the power and tenants compete against each other with little leverage for the few apartments available. To reduce that structural imbalance of power, you need to add housing so that landlords compete with tenants. Next slide. There are so many important aspects of the housing problem, not all of which are captured or addressable through the charter. Rent stabilization provides a critical support to over 1 million apartments, but is largely a creature of state law. Property taxes shape what is built and where, but is largely a creature of state law. There's budgetary support at the federal and state level for the housing we build and preserve. And environmental review shapes the cost of constructing new housing and where we build it, which is largely a creature of state law. What the charter does control is the land use process, the process through which we approve changes like zoning changes, and who makes decisions. And in the proposals we'll talk through, you'll see that the primary way of intervention through the charter is to restructure the process by which land use decisions are made. ULURP was written into our charter 50 years ago. And in many ways, it is the envy of other jurisdictions and a model. It provides a clear timeline for review. It provides a path to integrate local feedback, borough feedback, expert feedback, and the views of democratically accountable elected officials. We have heard virtually no testimony, and we've heard a lot of ideas. We've heard virtually no testimony calling to scrap ULURP altogether, and commission staff do not recommend any wholesale changes to ULURP. That said, we now have 50 years of experience with ULURP and 36 years of experience since the 1989 reforms put the city council at the end of the ULURP process. And that experience has revealed certain flaws in the current public review procedure that this commission may wish to address. Next slide. One problem is that ULURP is categorically broken for modest and incremental projects. We have done an analysis of the last 10 years of all private applications looking to increase residential capacity in the city. As you'll see, there are many districts where there were no applications to increase housing at all in a decade. Many other districts, there are fewer than one application a year. Only some districts see a healthy clip of development. And I should say applications, and that matches quite clearly with the districts that are seeing the most housing growth today. We also see that the ULURP applications that do come through usually ask for big leaps and big changes rather than small or modest changes. Only one application in 10 years sought an increase of less than 40% of residential capacity. Only two sought a change to a low-density district, meaning that in low-density parts of our city, if someone's seeking a ULURP, they're asking for a big jump to a medium or high-density zoning district. What that tells you is that only some parts of our city are seeing development activity today, in part because of what is coming through the pipeline through ULURP, and also that ULURP today delivers only the kind of larger changes that communities find it harder to grapple with, and that it categorically prevents the kind of incremental, modest, and organic kinds of development that communities say they'd most like to see, even though those have been historically a critical part of how we house New Yorkers. Next slide. The charter only captures some of what is true about our housing and land use system. And what we've heard so much in our hearings so far is that one of the most important pieces of the land use system in New York City isn't in the charter at all. It's a city council practice of member deference, a kind of agreement among council members that the whole authority of the city council will be exercised by the single member who represents that area. Now, defenders point out that member deference is one of the most important channels for local views to change and shape projects in our system today. And it gives council members leverage to negotiate changes to projects and community benefits alongside projects. But as this commission has heard, member deference also means that if a member is against a housing project, it is sure to be defeated. No housing proposal has been approved through ULURP over a local member's objection in 16 years. And as the builders of affordable housing have come to this commission and said, that reality deters even an application to build housing in much of the city. We heard from Kirk Goodrich of Monadnock Development testimony that the first thing he does when he looks at a potential site for affordable housing is look up who the council member is. If that person is hostile to development, he never looks at that site again. And that tells us that perhaps the most important consequence of member deference is the applications we never see that are categorically prevented from even entering public review. Next slide, please. There's no shortage of critics of member deference, and they certainly span the ideological spectrum. Public advocate Jumaane Williams, as far back as 2017, expressed concern that member deference perpetuates segregation in the city, given the underlying residential segregation of our city. And his warning certainly has some substantiation if you look at the Department of Housing and Urban Development's letter to Chicago, where they noted that Chicago's similar aldermanic privilege disproportionately harms Black and Hispanic Chicagoans because they're most in need of affordable housing and perpetuates segregation given their underlying patterns of residential segregation. Former council members Donovan Richards and Richie Torres have both criticized member deference as a kind of feudal system where only local views are given decisive control. And I think we heard very compelling testimony from former council member Marjorie Velasquez, who is a former council member, most people think, because she did vote to approve a housing project in her district. And she explained that she received death threats along the way to doing so. And I think her testimonies underlies the difficult position our system puts members in today. It asks them to do heroic things, putting their jobs on the line, perhaps endangering their own families, simply to approve housing. Next slide. What does one do about these challenges? Well, we've heard many ideas, and we've tried to sort them into three potential categories: reducing process costs, elevating citywide needs, and leveraging public land. Each of these reforms would tweak the process of review for certain kinds of land use changes. ULURP would remain in place for most changes. Nothing proposed here would automatically make it legal to build anything upon approval of by a referendum. Everything would still require a form of public review. Likewise, none of these proposals would alter existing rules around environmental review, building and construction standards, or protections for historic districts or landmarks. Reducing process costs. We have heard proposals to fast track certain kinds of housing. Can we create a simpler, shorter process for modest housing projects of the kind we do not see in ULURP today? We've heard calls for a simpler and shorter process for categorically beneficial housing projects, like all affordable housing. One proposal, for example, would create a new action before the Board of Standards and Appeals for a waiver for affordable housing projects. We have heard calls for general changes to ULURP to speed all ULURP applications up. One very common suggestion is to combine the period of community board and borough president review. Under that proposal, community boards would have all the time they have today, but the borough president's advisory role would be moved into the same period to save 30 days. We've also heard proposals to address other land use procedures that are in and around the charter. Today, for example, dispositions of health and hospitals land are not subject to the same clock as other things. And there have been calls to maybe attach clocks because in the absence of a clock, certain land use actions can remain dormant or kind of pocket vetoed to avoid making difficult political decisions. Elevating citywide needs. Much of what we heard is that our current system has dialed too far in the direction of hyper-local concerns, particularly as a result of member deference, and that a better balance needs to be struck between those local views, which must continue to have an important role, and the views of borough-wide and citywide perspectives. And we've also heard that this hyper-local process is underlying the inequitable patterns of growth we've seen and inequitable access to opportunity that flows from where one lives. One genre of reform we've heard is to take a more comprehensive approach to planning. The notion being that the current piecemeal approach of land use review with ad hoc neighborhood or private applications doesn't give the right perspective or facilitate the right kind of decision making. One flavor of a proposal we've heard is to take the City Council's Fair Housing Framework, which unanimously passed the Council in 2023, and to add some teeth to it so that a consequence of failing to meet a district level target adopted through a process would be the fast tracking of certain mixed income housing or affordable housing. This proposal has been made by the New York Housing Conference, Enterprise Community Partners, Open New York, the Fifth Avenue Committee, and others. A proposal like this builds upon models around the country, including in New Jersey, which has had a system called Mount Laurel Doctrine for some 50 years. Another approach is comprehensive planning. Comptroller Lander, Borough President Reynoso, ANHD, and the Thriving Communities Coalition have called not just for a holistic plan addressing where housing ought to be built, but one that would require a holistic master plan for the whole city, touching on issues like transportation and schools. Once adopted, these proposals suggest, typically, although they vary, that projects in accordance with the plan would be fast-tracked. New York City used to have a similar master plan requirement, but no master plan was ever adopted, and it could be time for the city to try again, proponents say. Another idea is to empower borough-wide and citywide actors in the process. The idea being to strike a better balance between local views and borough and citywide views by giving officials with borough and city perspectives a greater role. Borough President Reynoso and Gibson have both called for giving BPs a greater role in land use again. Along these lines, the Commission has received proposals to create a new appeals board at the end of the ULURP process. These proposals would eliminate the mayoral veto and the council override to the veto, and replace them with a new board to hear land use matters after the council has taken a pass. One proposal, for example, would create a 3-official body, including the mayor, council, and borough president. The agreement of 2 of the 3 officials on the board would be needed to overrule a council action. Others have proposed giving the City Planning Commission, with a supermajority, the power to override the council on particular applications and maybe changing the structure of the City Planning Commission when it does so. Leveraging public land. Another set of reforms is designed to make it easier for the city to activate public land for affordable housing. It is often much harder for the city to build affordable housing on its own land than it would be for a private actor to build market rate housing. Can we ease that process so the city can better leverage city-owned land to combat the housing crisis? Ideas include simplifying dispositions of city-owned land to HDFCs, which are regulated affordable housing developers for affordable housing. Another idea is to correct the one-size-fits-all problem of ULURP today, where the sale of city-owned lots, even if they are mere inches wide, is subject to the same process of the sale of tracts as large as Hudson Yards. Can we change the process for small lots? Can we also make it easier for the city to acquire lots to build affordable housing? Here's some of the ideas that the staff recommend be investigated. Next slide. Although the commission was convened to look for, first and foremost, at housing and land use, as you know, the single largest category of written testimony we have received respects our system of elections and methods to attempt to address the abysmal voter turnout in municipal elections. Today, turnout is very low and has been on a slow and steady decline. Turnout is especially low among minority communities, among young people. And people who are not registered with a major political party today are largely locked out of the most important elections because of a system of closed party primaries. We have made recent and promising shifts. In New York in 2021 had its first election using ranked choice voting, and it has shown promising results so far in altering the conduct of our elections. But turnout remains a pervasive problem. Next slide. One idea we have heard is to move New York City's elections from odd years, where they're currently held, and to sync them with even years, perhaps with the presidential cycle, where turnout is more than twice as high on average as our odd year elections. Evidence shows that municipalities that move to even year elections consolidated with a presidential cycle see big jumps in their turnout. Phoenix saw its turnout jump from 21% to 77% by making this change. Baltimore saw a jump from 13% to over 60% by making this change. In addition to increasing turnout, the IBO estimates that consolidating elections would save the city about $42 million every 2 years, which is about the Department of City Planning's annual budget. This change has been supported by the Independent Campaign Finance Board, the Brennan Center, Citizens Union, Common Cause, and others. But of course, this change would not just require a change to local law under state law, but it would also require a constitutional amendment, which is currently under consideration in Albany. Next slide. Another change would be to open up New York City's closed party primary system. Today, more than 1 million unaffiliated voters are excluded from primary elections. Jurisdictions throughout the United States do it a little bit differently, with top 2, top 4 open primaries, or what are called jungle primaries. One notable proposal from Citizens Union would be to conduct an open primary in which all candidates and all voters may participate, and then use ranked choice voting to determine the top 2 candidates who could proceed to compete in a general election. Recently, the Independent Campaign Finance Board released a report noting that opening New York's closed primary system to unaffiliated voters would likely increase voter turnout and make the electorate more representative. That report noted that unaffiliated voters are disproportionately young. Nearly half of all unaffiliated voters are under 40. More than a quarter are under 30. And that research from around the country shows that allowing unaffiliated voter participation has yielded more demographically and politically representative voting populations. It also, and I'm quoting, cites research showing that primary systems that are open to unaffiliated voters or entirely nonpartisan tend to result in higher voter turnout. Next slide. Another problem we have heard much about is that the city, although it relies on nonprofits and other vendors to deliver very critical city services, does a very poor job of paying them on time. Now, this is not a problem unique to this moment or this administration. It is a problem that goes back quite a bit of time. As far back as the Koch administration, there are reports you could read today, and it looks like Mad Libs about the problems we continue to see. And when you have a problem that's persisted for so long across so many administrations, you start to wonder whether maybe there is a structural component to the issue. We have heard various ideas for potential structural reforms to make it easier for the city to register contracts and to timely pay vendors. One would be to elevate and empower the Mayor's Office of Contract Services, give it new powers and charge it with creating new rules around contract advances and partial payment of invoices and perhaps the late payment of interest. People have called for structural changes to the PPB, which plays a big role in regulating procurement. There's been a call to reform the way that discretionary contracts of some kinds are processed because it can be easier to process these as grants rather than contracts, especially where there's a proliferation of very small awards in the form of discretionary contracts. And other ways to streamline contracting practices, like enabling more master agreements or facilitating the automatic renewal of multi-year contracts. Next slide. We have also heard that the charter's land use procedures can get in the way of certain critical climate and infrastructure investments. It's probably not a surprise that our charter needs an overhaul in this way. In 1989, that was just 1 year after NASA scientist James Hansen first went to the US Senate and testified about the existence of a, quote, greenhouse effect. So we perhaps did not have the urgency of the climate crisis most in mind when we last looked at this issue. Today, we've heard testimony that the existing charter process makes it very difficult to do common sense changes that help protect vulnerable communities, like raising the grade of a street by just a couple of feet, which today can require a full ULURP process, or acquiring certain property, or making certain mapping actions that are consistent with making our waterfront more resilient. We've also heard that the current system, which requires a full ULURP to simply buy out homeowners that are vulnerable, makes it very difficult to do voluntary buyouts and keeps homeowners in danger. We've also heard that our existing system of revocable consents and franchises may be significantly complicating our ability to scale up electric vehicle infrastructure across the city. Certainly, many of my neighbors in Brooklyn are like taking outlets and streaming weird cords out of their windows to try to charge their electric vehicles. That certainly doesn't seem like a sustainable solution over time if we're going to move off gas-dependent cars. Next slide. And finally, we have heard people say that we should probably do something we might have considered doing in 1898, which is creating one map of the city. Um, Many will be surprised to know that today our city map is spread across 5 different borough president county offices across over 8,000 individual pieces of paper. And that this system, which is very much rooted in the middle of the last century, can complicate many everyday functions and slow the development process or address assignment and gum up the works. So the staff recommend looking at the centralization and digitization of the city map, which could potentially make almost simultaneous tomorrow changes that today can take weeks and months. Those are the proposals of the staff to you, and we welcome your questions.
Before we open up the questions, I just want to thank you and the staff for an incredible amount of work. It really is. Across a range of complex issues with a range of voices and opinions, I think a really powerful effort both to harmonize ideas, but also to make clear judgments, and clear recommendations, which we deeply appreciate. But with that, let's open up to questions or comments from commissioners.
One comment, title reducing process costs. I think it's the accurate frame is you're reducing process, but you're basically project costs. I think that's a more compelling argument to the public, given how high housing development costs have risen. So I would say that, and I don't know if you want to throw in risk as well. Certainly, I would say you're reducing development.
I think that's right.
I would just add to what Kathy just said, that we're in a time where we're faced with really substantial federal cuts to the city's budget and to not-for-profits budgets. And in times of stress like this, and I go back to the mid-1970s fiscal crisis, the ability to find new ways to reduce costs and absorb some of these anticipated cuts in a way that doesn't undermine fundamental values is really important. And that is particularly going to be important in the housing area.
Yeah, and Carl, I would just reiterate that for nonprofit contracting as well.
And not
The financial burdens that organizations are already facing are substantial, and anything we can do to make sure that at least city payments flow more efficiently and more effectively to the sector, always critical. It's been critical for a long time, but could not be more critical than today.
I would just echo what Carl and Richard said here. And I actually think that when we go about explaining why we're doing this, that actually should be a part of the explanation, because I think that will resonate with New Yorkers very much.
Well, it also is a way to show that we're making local efforts to respond to some of the Trump stuff, and maybe that's a way showing that how reasonable.
For me, I think the through line on all of these is one of access. We're talking about access to faster payment here. We're talking about access to faster process. We're talking about access to voters. That I think is an important theme to highlight across each of these areas.
Yeah, I have something to say in terms of like it probably correlates to everything, but I wonder if I heard in that, particularly I'm thinking about the nonprofit payments, if there was the idea of accountability written in there. And I know working with some of the nonprofits and the city to try and get to address those issues, one of the suggestions in terms of accountability was the idea of a tracker, which we might have heard about recently, to institute some level of accountability and metrics and stuff. And if we have that written in, even with the other things that we have proposed, if that exists.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. One aspect of the procurement reforms that's being contemplated is requiring new transparency and disclosure around late payment and performance, which can help shed light on persistent problems in procurement and registration. At the same time, all changes need to take into account the very serious need to ensure vendor integrity and vendor performance. And I think we would all have, I think, no change in mind that would weaken the city's ability to ensure that taxpayer dollars are being spent responsibly.
And just one note on that too, I think that's particularly important because I think there are limits to the charter's ability to, some of that is a question of just effective management and process. And I think every administration has made efforts, including this one, to do better. And I do want to give appreciation to the Mayor's Office of Contract Services, but also the Mayor's Office of Nonprofits, which I think has done really good work recently. But I do think accountability is very important because it's also a tool for managers and elected officials to drive attention to the work. So I agree, and I think very important here, given the just sort of the limitation, I think, to what the charter can actually do to solve the problem.
Right. I was actually going to say a similar thing on that because quite honestly, we could put into the charter that there's a requirement that we have to pay within a certain time frame, but that doesn't take into consideration the processes by which we have to do vendor integrity, that we have to check the systems that are put in place. Most of the challenges that nonprofits face first is the fact that we've transferred so much of the responsibility of government to the nonprofit sector. And we rely so much on small nonprofits because as a matter of policy, we want to encourage that type of community-based organizations who know the community that they're serving, whatever they happen to do. But many of them don't have capacity themselves, and they have a difficult time with capacity building, which hinders their ability to comply with the very complicated requirements of either applying for an RFP or a contract and then drawing down the funding. I mean, I can just say in my years in the Senate, I had numerous organizations who would come to me and say, we want to do this, but we don't have the staff to do it, and can you give us the money anyway? Well, obviously it doesn't work that way. So we may not be able to totally solve this problem, but certainly as a statement of purpose, yes, if we give a contract to an entity, there should be a reasonable expectation that they're going to get paid at least in this fiscal year, right? And I'm not sure how we write that into the charter. But on back on the housing thing, I mean, I think we're in an interesting place. Everybody that you speak to in this city, and I don't care what elected official it is, whatever part of the city is, all says the same thing. New York City has become too unaffordable for the people that they represent, whether that's on the Upper East Side or the South Shore of Staten Island. How we get to developing or streamlining the process for housing development for all of those people with disparate interests is going to be complicated. But I do think streamlining the process for certain projects, you're right, Alec, the idea that you have the same ULURP process for a 60-story apartment building on the Upper West Side as a 2-story townhouse on the South Shore of Staten Island makes no sense. The issue of member deference, though, is going to be critically important because if we run up into that buzzsaw, we will lose support from every elected official because they will see that as we are usurping their ability to make plans and decisions for the people who entrusted them to make plans and decisions. So I don't know the answer to that, and I don't know how we fix that, but that has to be part of the conversation. If we try and go around them, we will meet tremendous resistance on that because that's an easy argument for people to make against a charter revision question that might touch the issue. And I don't even know how we would do that, considering member deference is simply just the functioning of a legislative body. They all trust each other to make decisions. And if that breaks down, then they have not, they don't have the ability to really plan for their own communities. So
Reinforcing community board and borough president. And I think that that's a balance. And in the appeals provision, the power of the speaker of the city council. And really, the decision about member deference is in the hands of the speaker of the city council. It's not in law, it's not in charter, it's purely the speaker allows it or doesn't allow. So I think that we can address
Mhm.
The issue that we are not undermining community representation. We in fact are reinforcing it with some of what we're doing. So
Right.
I don't have
Trying
a
to
problem
balance
it with some citywide perspective.
Right.
It's with the city.
Right.
So if you add in the borough president, you add in the
Right.
mayor, right? And again, all elected officials themselves who have to respond. But
In time, fine
Right.
that the city council and the borough president will work together, blah, blah, not
Mhm.
the city council, the,
Community boards.
mhm.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I hear you, Diane, but I think that the way that we would talk about this isn't, we're not even gonna say we are affecting member deference. We are saying that there are categories of actions
Mhm.
that can't get done in today's world. And they have to have a path that allows them to proceed outside of this process. And wherever we end up on that, I think that's really where we have to make our point, is that we're trying to facilitate the building of housing in an easier way. We're leaving ULURP as it is for most things, but for certain subcategories of housing, we're going to do something that's a little more expedited, a little easier. And the categories that we're going to do it in are categories where we're talking really about minimal incremental growth. And I think we have to make that point too. We're not going to let somebody build a tower in St. George. You
Mhm.
know, it's going to be incremental things. And so to me, the way we talk about this has to not be that we are trying to change member deference. We're just trying to facilitate categories of housing to be built in an easier way. And
Mhm.
if we stay with that and also emphasize the ways in which we are incorporating community input and other elected officials' input, I think we have a chance here to get this done.
Mhm.
And your, I think it was, what, two proposals of how to, in the case where maybe, according to the community needs or the city needs, that you have I forgot what you called it, the executive, not an executive body, but you have the combination of the city council member, the borough president, and the appeals
Mhm.
board. I think that also has a place that is a good way to sort of like get around the hard issues, and of course it varies community by community.
If I could offer one thought on that, when we read back in the history of 1975 and 1989, when voters approved ULURP and when they approved changes to make the city council at the end of the ULURP process, the system we have today is not what they had in mind. If you go back and look, it was table stakes in those debates that there should not be a hyper local veto, that a community board, for example, should not have a material power to veto projects. Rather, that they should have a voice in the process that would then be balanced with borough-wide and citywide interests. That is the procedure the framers of those amendments put to the voters, and that is the procedure that the voters approved, not just in 1975, but again in 1989. The system of member deference, which has sort of accrued over time and now is cement, right, is a system that I think distorts the land use review procedure that the voters, that New Yorkers approved. And that's been revealed by experience over time.
I think that language is important. It's not a system, it's a courtesy, a legislative courtesy
Mhm.
that is now being applied in ways that were not predicted, to your point. I don't think we should address in the preliminary report and our recommendation, I don't think we should even mention member deference
did.
because it's not a law.
It's in here though.
We should just ignore it, and we should point out that we're reinforcing the role of the borough presidents and the community boards to
I disagree.
participate, and the role of the speaker of the city council.
Well, I mean, I think member deference is an open secret, and this preliminary report has tried to speak about it the way you would speak about it if you took truth serum. That's certainly how I looked at this report. And
Alec, I'd like to jump in actually on a couple of points. One is the first point is that, particularly with member deference, I'd love the document to refer to where there has been a lot of voice and input and recognition that we are double clicking on the point that was said that this is not about building, 100-story building in Staten Island, that this is really about expediting building and that we're actually broadening some input on that. I think that's an important point, right? It's not just semantics, it's actually an important value. I think the second thing is when we're talking about contractors, one thing that came up in some of our talks that we had too, is that we don't want to see, obviously, the opportunity costs are, we have dollar signs related to that, to what nonprofits are taking on, right? The challenge is also that we want to make sure that there's increased capacity at MOCs to support getting these documents out, right? These payments out. And we can't ignore that either in this process. So I just want to put that there. And then the last thing is too, I think there's no question, Sarvina said this, but that we have enormous levels of nonprofits that are taking on the role in what other cities would consider city services. I actually think that's what makes this city great. I wouldn't change that. I think that that's an important piece, but that requires us to be much more cognizant of the fact that we're making them pay a price for this that they shouldn't have to be paying. So anything we can do to expedite that. And I do want to add one last thing. As a lifelong New Yorker, you know, this piece around affordability is really important. And this piece about fair share is really important. And I think those pieces came out clear in there, but this isn't just about affordability. This is also about building other housing as well too. But I just want to like acknowledge the fact that you guys did work on that piece, and I appreciated that. So thank you.
Mhm.
Alec, if I could just jump in. Can you hear me? Great. One of the things that I really appreciate, and thank you to your team for all the work, is the cost analysis on some of these proposals. I am wondering if we could do a little bit more of that. This one map, for example, it seems pretty simple, but what's the cost to the city, or what's the cost right now of not having one? That would be great to know. I would say the same thing for the nonprofit sector. I think we've heard enough testimony of the unintended consequences to the end user. But some of the things that we haven't really laid out as far as financing is and cost of living is the workforce in the nonprofit sector, who I think would also benefit from housing. So this is an interesting ecosystem. And acknowledging the number of New Yorkers that work in the nonprofit sector, how they are priced out as well, while we're asking them to be essential workers and do service, I think is a good argument for us to put out to New Yorkers that sometimes they are just not aware of.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Thank you. And just on that point, we can certainly, as more detailed proposals are developed, do a better job within, the realm of intellectual honesty and integrity and soundness, try to size the costs and benefits of these proposals.
And I just want to, if we go back to affordability, like, right, we talk about affordability and how we want to get to a place where we bring down the cost of housing because we are increasing the supply. Everybody gets that. But what we forget though is because of the very complicated rules we have in place, whether it's the ULURP process or the extended process for permitting or HBD fine, whatever it happens to be, we make housing way more expensive to build. And we went through this last year when we were seeking changes to the 485X program in Albany, where we had members who said, well, I'll support a law that says you have 100% affordable units at the lowest possible income level. And we were just like, this is simple math. It doesn't work. The price of land is not going down. The cost of construction is not coming down. The only thing that we can control is how long it takes and the complicated rules and regulations that you have to go through to build a bathroom in a city park. That we can do something about. We can't control the cost of land. Insurance is another issue that we struggle with.
Because the other question that I had for the staff, if at all possible, if we could look at the cities that have used public land to build and what it has done to those neighborhoods from an affordability perspective. But I'm also wondering what it does to folks who have grown up in those neighborhoods. Are they being priced out? Or are they being pushed out because of the use of public land?
Sure, we can look at that.
New York
Yeah.
City in the 1980s is.
I was gonna say, we have that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have all that data.
Mhm.
Just to connect a point, I'd say Kathy's initial comment with what Diane was just saying and the affordability conversation in general, which is that I think that in the housing world, what the idea of providing or creating affordability is somewhat rooted in the fact that there are external factors or macro items that you can't control. So to the extent that you lower a household's rent, you do provide some way for them to, in other words, be more competitive, or you might say dynamic. Now, if you then translate that into New York City, as this point is being made, there are plenty of factors that will contribute to the cost to build housing in New York City. But if we can lower the cost of the ones that we control, then we do the same thing we do on a household or family level, we do it for the city. You had a chart that showed the relative competitiveness or how other cities are building more housing. And I can tell you that the cost structures are different in those other cities. So can we control everything here? Obviously not. But that underscores the importance of lowering the cost of the items that we can control. So.
I just want to, if I can comment too on, for the final report, I hear what you're saying, Kathy, around, I don't think our recommendations need to reference member deference, but I do feel strongly, I mean, this goes to treating the crisis as a crisis. We should not sugarcoat how we've gotten here in any way. And yes, the council members, local electeds obviously have, they're looking out for their constituents and we heard so much testimony in defense of existing processes that really is about, everyone's heart, I think, is in the right place. But I don't think we should sugarcoat that what has defaulted to member preference has created a massive crisis. And I'm not comfortable taking that. And I think it's well described in the report right now. I don't think we should water that down in any way. I agree that our recommendations don't need to point to member deference.
I agree.
They just need to point to balancing views and addressing our crises. And similarly, I mean, I think referencing and talking about the federal crisis matters, but this pre-exists what's happening in the federal government right now. And I think we should also own that a lot of this is a local issue that we have created. The federal, withdrawal and funding cuts makes it more urgent, but that's not causing the crisis right now.
I think we're trying to address, all of these have been touched on, but 3 goals and make them consistent and mutually supportive. One is reducing costs and the role that reducing costs, either through time or supply or both, play in increasing the availability of housing, which we all recognize is critical. 2, the issue of equity, which is, we know that neighborhoods have, as Alex and the staff have pointed out, we have a very segregated city, and we have an obligation to address that, I think, and do it in a way where every neighborhood and community does accept and embrace its fair share of housing growth generally. That's been the goal of the city council, and that's our goal as well. And the third, how do we best balance the local interests with the interests of the city as a whole? And I think that those are the 3 pillars on which our recommendations should be based. And I really commend the staff for coming up with recommendations that address all of those.
Can I make a friendly amendment, which is around the impact of those? And it goes to all the points around the impact analysis, which is not where you can understand what the cause and effect might be. So that one chart, for example, that had I apologize for my voice, the one chart that had the 3 size circles that showed you sort of what housing was done, to understand what might change over the next 5 to 10 years with the provisions that we're talking about, I think would be very powerful, because it's these 3 things plus then what's the impact of those changes.
We'll try to do our best. There's a crystal ball problem here.
Yeah.
And anything we put out, we want to believe is shedding more light than smoke.
Right. And I don't think we can leave here without discussing one of the other major issues that has been presented to us, actually the issue that we've heard the most about, which is election reform. There is no doubt that members are afraid to make decisions about complex projects in their district because they are afraid of going before the voters every 2 years or every 4 years, depending on where they are. And the reason they're afraid to go before the voters in their own districts is because less and less people are voting in this city, and the ones who do turn out are increasingly more radicalized on both sides of the aisle, whether we want to admit that or not. We're a blue city, but we are driven by a very small fraction of the Democratic Party electorate. And the single best thing we can do to improve conditions in this city, in my opinion, is to change the voting process so that we have open, nonpartisan primaries, so more voters are able to participate. It is an embarrassment that we have over 5 million registered voters in the city of New York, and we are at the lowest level of turnout since the 1950s. But that little narrow band of people are driving these decisions, because no matter what people think, when you're an elected official, you care about one opinion, and that's the people who are turning out to vote for you. And if they all show up in front of your office or on election day screaming at you because you voted for this, you are never going to consider another project again.
That's what Marjorie.
It's what happened to her.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Thing. That's exactly right.
I see it. I've had a million conversations with other elected officials over the years who say, I agree, I want to do this, but I can't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The only way we
So-
change that is bring more voices into that conversation, voters who are engaged, informed, and have already made a decision that they don't want to be part of the circus. But
Yeah,
we're
so for,
deliberately cutting them out.
yeah, I would say, Diane, the piece that I would be supporting on open primaries is not so much about which are the voices, but the voices that I'm particularly focused on, which are the under 40s, which are people who we're seeing not as civically engaged, right? Because it does break down by generation. It does.
Mhm.
And I want to see more of those under 40s voting and actively engaged and seeing that they see themselves as not party affiliated. I think how could we
Right.
miss out on that? So I just want to make that point that I really appreciated was pointed out in the document as well.
And they have the most stake in the future of
They
the
do,
city
they do.
because, you know,
Mhm.
some of us are not going to be here in 30 years. Hopefully, who knows? Maybe they'll come up with the fountain of youth and we'll all be around forever. But this is really about the future development for the city of New York
Yeah,
and who's going to live here.
I think that the fact that, and which was surprising because I didn't know the number, but I think that the fact that we've gotten the most testimony in regards to that is very telling. And I also wanted to say, and thank you, Layla, for um, s- speaking on being bold in what we do. It's not really what we do. I think we have listened to a lot of testimony to kind of support the positioning and what's in the report. And I think that we have to keep following through on that, even in the area of not of dealing with the ULURP process in a bold way. And if we're going to develop more housing throughout this city, we are dealing with things like fair share. We are dealing with things like, for lack of another word, member deference and the ability to bring more housing about. And I don't think that's driven by what our personal thoughts are in and of itself as much as it is by what we're seeing and hearing from across the city and what people presented in their testimony.
Mhm.
Couple questions. I was also wondering if the staff has thought about or how we should think about, there's so many good ideas here and probably not all of them will turn into recommendations. Are there certain types of recommendations? We've heard a lot that actually there could be consensus for charter reform through legislation or through other means other than putting it on the ballot. That's worth thinking about. What are the most critical ones that really need to be on a ballot versus could be amendments through other means. And then similarly, or not similarly, separately on the open primaries, it seems like we heard about so many different flavors of
yes.
different primaries and how to think about the pros and cons of those different types of approaches, and whether we'd have to make recommendations on any specific one by the end of this process, or whether the kind of follow-up process that happens with the state could inform that.
Interesting
Whether
question.
we'd have to get specific.
Follow-up process.
Yeah, this
My
would be-
understanding is that we don't, with respect to open primaries, that's strictly local issue.
That's
Is that-
correct.
Just the even,
It's on the
even year election.
year.
Right.
Yeah, I
Even
can
year
try to,
election.
I can try to clarify. Even year elections will require additional state action to
Yeah,
be effectuated.
that's
State law
what-
requires us to go through a referendum process, to go through local law. There's also a state constitutional amendment process that would have to play out. So that's only with respect to even year elections. However, with respect to open primaries, that's within local control, does not require subsequent
But I-
state action. Yep.
Issue, what exactly, I mean, what exactly does it do for us to change the charter to the even year thing? It does nothing, right?
nothing.
It doesn't make
Just
it.
allows us to move forward
Yes,
if
if
and
the
when,
state does.
if the
Don't
state
we still
acts.
have to have a reservation,
We could have a question on the
Referendum?
ballot
No,
says
we-
that if the state were to move forward with a constitutional amendment adopting even year elections, we would then be able to move forward without having to come back.
Yeah,
and
if I could try to
vote the
just
law.
So right now, the version of the state constitutional amendment, which is in consideration in Albany and passed the Senate, but not the Assembly last year, would give New York the option of moving to even year elections. It would not compel the New York move to even year elections. Exercising that option under state law, under the state municipal home rule law, would require a commission like this, going through a process like this to put a question on the ballot. And so one utility of this commission going is to set up the rules of the road so that if Albany should put that state constitutional amendment to voters, and should it be approved, that we could sync up right away rather than requiring another subsequent process. So that's one utility.
To finalize our recommendation?
No,
Oh,
Here-
no.
no, because a state
do it.
constitutional amendment must pass two successive.
Well, if the legislature passes the authorization to go through the process for the state constitution.
We may or may
No.
not. We don't, so
I mean, they're
the,
either gonna do it
Right.
before the middle of June or they're not.
right, but the
No.
amendment that was passed last year, Alex, is irrelevant now. Because that was an old set and the assembly didn't pass it. So both houses would have to pass one
No, I
this year or
understand.
next year, and then again in 20.
Yeah, this is the point I was going to make.
Do we, does that move forward if the legislature decides both houses not to take it up? That seems sort of like an exercise. in
I think if I could help, and Alec, maybe just direct to you, I think it's not possible for the state to resolve the question in the time frame that
Right.
we're
Right.
discussing.
They can't do that.
And so I think
to, it is possible for them to indicate whether they're going to make an attempt to resolve it, both houses passing it. If both houses refuse to pass it before the middle of June, when they will go home to run in the elections, then what's the point
That's
of us
next year.
putting it on this charter revision?
Right, so I think my point is that because if I understand the rules correctly, it would take two successive votes.
does.
Right.
It's actually not
In two
possible to
different
resolve that in
terms,
this
right.
time. So what I would suggest, so this is obviously my opinion, and we'll have to discuss it. It is a strong signal, an important signal for this body to ask the voters of New York City what their preference is. I think if we can resolve that, I would not recommend that we wait. In fact, because we couldn't wait, then we'd be deferring, we'd be kicking the can down the road to another charter revision commission. But I would,
Regardless, we can't do
Right.
anything for 2 years.
well,
than that.
we can though.
More
I
than
mean,
that.
we can, the city voters can, right?
We, the voters in New York City are.
25,
opinion.
26.
I mean.
It won't be effective.
Right.
Yeah,
And we don't.
Is the
right.
earliest.
everything else we're talking about is within our power.
Mhm.
This one is outside our power, which I honestly didn't.
I would just
The
frame it a
least
little
it could
differently,
happen.
Kathy, which is that local action is necessary but insufficient to make this change.
But state action is necessary as
Mhm.
well.
Well,
Yeah.
absolutely. And
Yeah.
I just say there will be no situation where this commission can have clarity about whether a state constitutional amendment is going to go to voters
Right.
by the time it completes its action. If it intends to put a question, just please let me finish. If it's going to complete its work for this November. Now, this legislature, there's no difference between this legislature voting on this constitutional amendment this year or next. So they could very well wait for next, because then they're going to have to go through a whole new legislature convened in 2027 and then place it again. The earliest this could go on a ballot is 2028. So I guess I would say this is a very valid question, whether this complication should prevent the commission to act, but it would be a mistake to expect clarity this June.
Right.
I get it. I'm just saying that in one case, we've had them refuse to act on it, which suggests they may not act on it.
It might not.
We're putting an item on the ballot that's different from everything else.
That may or may never happen.
Have no control.
I would
That's
have
to say-
no control. I mean, it's very important to say that there is a material reason to place a question on the ballot, because local action under state law is necessary to effectuate this change, and because the amendment presently before the state legislature would require subsequent or prior local action. But I think it's just important that I clarify that for the record, and that's why I'm saying
Yeah,
it.
no, I think we get that. The question is whether or not with all the
we hear you.
things we have that we want to see on the ballot, there's kind of one story, voters up or down, this will make a difference.
It may never come to pass.
Can I just say, I don't know if this is where Kathy's going with this, but I'm wary about this, and I'm wary because whatever we do could create more confusion rather than less. We don't know what the legislature ultimately is going to do, what conditions they might put on it. We might recommend even year elections corresponding to gubernatorial elections or corresponding to presidential elections. The legislature, if it moves forward, could do something entirely different. And to me, I understand what you're saying, Richard, about demonstrating to the legislature the sentiment of New York voters, because in the past, Charter Commission resolutions regarding this issue have not gotten the support of New York voters. But to me, I think that there's a danger in moving forward with this before we know the direction in which the legislature is going.
I would just add, I think obviously, the reason why we have this commission is to engage on this conversation, and we could very well, and people, of course, on the commission have different point of view. I will express just my point of view for the record as well. I think it's two things. It's not only to express the will of the voters. I think that is critical, and I would argue that we should take responsibility of putting forward our point of view if we think that is the right point of view, and give the voters a chance to win. So one of it is about signaling the voters' intent and preference, but it is also about ultimately doing, if there are two things that have to happen, and there are two things that have to happen, one by the city's voters and one by the state legislature, it is about doing the part of that thing that we can control. I don't think there's anything about this process that says that we need to wait for the state legislature. I would frame it as both these things need to happen. So let's take on our part of responsibility if we think it's a good judgment. And I think the voters are smart enough to understand that here's what we think should happen, but there's further state action. And as voters, they also have a say in that too, because they also can hold their legislators, their state legislators to account for making sure that part of the process.
It's very possible they vote no. It's entirely possible that New York City voters would say, even if the state legislature does this, blah, 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 we would rather keep our local elections on this year and whatever.
Perfectly
I think the
right.
bigger question, let me just.
And it's
the bigger
within their
question we have to figure out is on the, if we're going to put a ballot question forward on the concept of nonpartisan open primaries, are we going to pick do we think we're going to pick a particular model, or are we just going to
Yes,
say?
that was
Yes, we
Layla's
have to.
question.
Yes.
Let me try to clarify that. We very much have to pick a model. We very much have to pick a model. And in fact,
in the-
I mean, the reform that, should you direct staff to draw it up would be a very particular flavor in all its detail for your consideration.
Mhm.
So just to clarify, I was thinking that legislature did put up a constitutional amendment under the law, it would still have to go to a referendum.
Mhm.
And that what we did now would not necessarily, the voters could pass the even year, and it wouldn't necessarily count in the
That's true.
real
Right, that's true.
world.
That's right.
That's true.
That to me seems my sort of
Wait,
a waste
right.
to me. Just because it doesn't, what does it accomplish? We can do a morning consult poll and find out what voters think.
The flip side is the legislature between this year and, or maybe before June or next January, whatever, they pass, the Senate and the Assembly pass a constitutional amendment. They then end their term. They come back in 27, right? 27, I'm losing track myself. They pass it again. The earliest it could go on the ballot would be November of 2027.
28,
28?
28.
28, no, it could, if
Because
it-
it's
if
a
they pass it in
statewide,
the
it would be a
first,
statewide election though.
but if they pass it in the first year of.
But what
second-
statewide election
second
is occurring in 2027 in which they
That's
would
right.
append the amendment?
So,
Mhm. No, but it could go on the ballot.
but Diane, finish your thought.
Well, anyway,
What's
so
the
you're-
point? Are you saying you're for it or?
No, the point I'm trying to make is the earliest we'd be looking at is 2028, right? 2028. The only thing this question would say is if the state legislature does this, then we would be empowered to sync up immediately as opposed to convening another charter revision commission to then put a ballot question in 2029 then.
So wait.
28?
No,
Can we do it at the same time?
I
Hold
don't
on.
think-
no, if this commission acts to put the question to voters and it's approved,
Right.
then that system would be ready and in place upon a statewide approval of an even year system. If the commission neglects to do that for very good reasons, like uncertainty that Carl is pointing out, and all of this I think is identified in the report as valid reasons to not take action here. But if the commission decides not to take action on this issue for those reasons, then there would have to be after 2028 another charter revision commission
Right.
that would convene and consider and put that question to voters. Now that
29.
commission in 29 at the earliest. And that commission would have the benefit of understanding fully the system that the state had laid out, but it would have the cost of further delay. And I'll note one thing, which I think is something that you should mull as commissioners. Right now, if we make this decision in the face of some uncertainty about what state action is, we do not know who it affects. And that has real value in trying to decide a system before you know which particular elected officials will be affected by it.
Mhm.
If we take action to local level only after we know when it would take effect, then you no longer have the veil of ignorance, so to speak. You are deciding whose term would be shortened by 1 year or lengthened by 1 year, and that can maybe color how people will look at those issues at that time.
The only other thing I will say on this issue, because I think we wasted too much time on it already, is if we were to move forward with a question this year that says, if at some point the legislature does this and the voters approve it, we're ready to move forward. It's entirely possible that the voters of New York City may say no. And that will send a signal to the state legislature to not pursue this constitutional amendment. So we need to take that into
I
consideration.
don't think, Dan, I don't think it's a waste of time. I mean, to the extent this is a live issue and it's one of the issues that clearly there's a difference of opinion on. I think it's very helpful to air that out as we, the good news, we don't have to decide this today. We have ongoing hearings. I think we've heard, I mean, I have a different point of view, but I definitely understand, I understand and respect the alternative one. I don't think it's unreasonable. And so I think we have to continue as a commission to mull it over the next month and a half to, yeah.
Clear one way or the other. I just don't, I want our process and our ultimate recommendations to be as clean as possible.
Yeah.
And this is based on our discussion.
That's murky.
This is
Murky.
Very
Mhm.
confusing.
And
What-
just for the record, I just would like to say, personally, I'm in favor of moving to even
Yeah, no,
year elections.
yeah.
Yeah.
I just
Understand the
think,
point, yeah.
I just think
But can
there's
I
a
just add,
real challenge here of potentially creating more confusion rather
Right.
than less. And to Diane's point, if the voters, if we put something on the ballot now and the voters reject it, so be it. But if we put something on the ballot and it becomes meaningless because whatever the legislature does puts conditions that we might not be aware of on what this is, it's going to require another charter commission anyway.
My only thing, Carl, I
So-
wouldn't describe it as meaningless. Like
Right.
I appreciate, I mean, I actually
Right.
Meaningless is
appreciate
too
the-
strong.
Right, I understand, but I appreciate the point that it may not be wise
Right.
for all the factors that
Mm.
you described, and particularly in the context where I think you want to be, we don't want to throw 40 things at
Correct,
the
yeah.
voters, right? So I think there's a So I do agree
Right.
with the sentiment.
Yeah.
My point of view is that it is not meaningless. It's because it's something that we all value, articulating it, having New York City voters both express their point of view and do their job, because ultimately they'll have to do it anyway. It's not, I would say it's not meaningless, but I appreciate the.
No.
I take back meaningless.
No.
And I just want to add,
sorry,
sorry,
go ahead, go ahead.
I just want to add, the reason that we're talking about this, let's not forget, is because of low voter turnout.
Right.
And we
Correct.
think this will make a difference. And so for me, the reason to pursue it now is it's almost an insurance policy for the future, which is to say, how can we drive participation going forward, knowing that there's a multi-step process, but at least acknowledging that there's a problem we must fix structurally.
There's
Alex,
there's a
Just-
problem, but it's also an
I just wanted
efficiency
to,
issue as well. I'm sorry.
I
go
was
ahead.
just gonna say that hearing this, am appreciating how we are going to have to prioritize and limit what we're gonna put on the ballot. I mean, we're going to have to decide whatever number of things we think we can put on the ballot, because we're not gonna put 30 things on the ballot. And so there's a element here of, uncertainty that weighs to me in putting this a little bit lower. But I really do think we're going to have to think, what are the most important things that we can get through on the ballot that will do what we need to do? And I think there are things in all three of those categories that we talked about today that are must. It's just not clear to me at the moment that this one wins,
Mhm.
And can I
Mhm.
just raise to that point, to that more general point that Anita's raising, and this is maybe to you, Alec, and to others who have been on charter commissions before, just I mean, how many resolutions can we really effectively put on the ballot to make without creating a huge amount of confusion? Do we have a number in mind? I know that there's been charter commissions with an almost infinite number of resolutions, and others with half a dozen or so or fewer. And I just don't know if there's a sweet spot.
Yes, there's no formal limit. My suggestion is the right way to think about it is what have commissions done in the past effectively without seeing like drop off down the ballot. There's a clear indication of voter exhaustion. Last year, voters considered 6. That would seem to me to be close to an upper limit. The last year's Charter Revision Commission put 5 on the ballot. There was 6 on the ballot because of that state constitutional amendment. But voters proved able to consider and pass on all 6 of those. I do think you get into a danger zone. It's hard to know where it is, but as you get longer, but as you have noted, there have been commissions that have put far more than 6 on the ballot.
And the more
Yeah.
complicated.
Yeah, Alex, I just want to clarify something on the elections question. Doing it in this order, is there a question about whether whatever opinion is expressed by the voters, whether that's subject to some legal challenge? Is that a question? Did I read that
Yes.
correctly?
So, as you know, any election question we put on the ballot is going to be subject to a pre-clearance process, likely under the State Voting Rights Act. And that will involve an iterative process with the state attorney general. And we are looking very closely at the considerations that are relevant to that pre-clearance process to inform you and to allow us to put together an effective pre-clearance submission to the Attorney General should you decide to put election-related questions to the ballot. So that is very actively in progress. We have commissioned a voting rights expert with a lot of experience to look hard at the data. And we are also in the process of retaining counsel to assist in making that pre-clearance submission should you all decide to put election questions to voters.
Can I ask a question just before we close, because I know we're almost over. On going back on the procurement, I am curious as to whether we have the time and the staff has the capacity to really look more deeply at the procurement issue, because I have a real problem with messing with that our proposal is basically expanding the authority of MOX, or the primary proposal is structurally. I have always, I don't want to create another redundancy in city government. Already have
Mm-hmm.
a plethora, without looking at eliminating the PP. Because I think that to create a new entity that's supposedly authorized, that we're asking for conflict, delay, more mishigas. Do that. And I just don't know, because we have had relatively little testimony on the larger procurement issues. I'm not expert in this area, but my sense is that messing in this area without some real efficient search, dangerous.
Interesting.
So, do we have room, or is there testimony and that was submitted and stuff like that? 'Cause I've been in some of those conversations, and from what I'm hearing, once again, not the expert, but what I'm hearing is real viable solutions. I don't know if we address that as a commission, or, you know, if there's something, things that the city could do, but I do think it's worth really looking over the testimony, and if there's any additional information that we can get, that we can do more of a deep dive into
Well,
that, because
I mean, we do have 5 additional hearings scheduled, and I would think that we can make sure that, particularly as it relates to the role of the PPB, procurement, PPB versus MOX,
Yeah.
I think we could definitely sort of encourage some additional testimony to help resolve.
Yeah.
Say-
And we could, and I would say on
Yeah,
this is an
yeah.
area that I hear from people constantly on.
Yeah, right.
I know Rich Bury does, I know Grace Bonilla does, I know Greenberg. I'm just saying this is an area we hear constantly on, constantly.
Can I get?
Yeah, I would say we
And
have
not
received,
procurement generally, I don't think most people know what the
Right.
PPB is.
Policy
But yeah,
procurement.
I think, right.
I
Right,
just
there's no
want to
question, right?
say-
That's not in the everyday conversation, right? PPB is
Right.
not, that's in my
I'm
boring
just
daily
saying,
It's
conversation.
nonprofit
In my
payments.
experience, there were often, when I was dealing with city contracts on a regular basis, there was often questions of log jams, and
Mhm.
PPV and that whole mystery came up. And I just think if we pretend we're solving a problem by just expanding the authority of MOX in ways that are unclear, that may not be solving the
Right.
real problem.
Mhm.
And that we ought to have, and I just don't know if we have the capacity between now and then to
Well-
understand.
well, if I could just
Well-
say that we have developed a more detailed proposal that we can share with you around what the authority of MOX would be
Mhm.
for your consideration, to see whether you think it's consistent with your concern. I also think,
About what we don't know about PPB and how that functions and how it would relate to these new.
no, I think it's, yes, the known unknowns.
Mhm.
So what I'll say is, we have been working very closely with people across city government who do understand procurement. As complicated as it is, we have been working very closely with them to try to structure appropriate reforms mindful of this concern. We can also, and we have received written testimony, detailed written testimony from the IBO and others sort of getting into this, but we can ask follow-up testimony and invite them to come to speak in more detail about the particular concern about PPB's authority.
Because I have not heard or read anything that really deals with this issue.
Not in a fine grain.
And I really think this is the core.
I agree, Catherine.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it's a good idea, and I would say that for me, it would be a priority, particularly given how far along we are with other proposals. So not to speak for the staff, but I would think that this is something that we can make sure that we resolve those questions. And I think what you're asking for in particular, the MOX versus the PPB in particular, is something that actually is on my mind as well.
Right.
And so I agree with you.
I think it'd be so compelling if we can understand these
Mhm.
different roles and then be able to say, we are
Streamlining and
streamlining.
simplifying.
Right.
Right.
We can and will prioritize it.
Okay. I have a technical question, and maybe you haven't even thought about this yet. Last year, when they had the actually, I think it was 2021, the state legislature adopted a change to constitutional amendments, requiring them to be written in simple language at an 8th grade reading level, and that the question couldn't be more than, Ed, what was it, 15 words? 15 words? Right. So it did not apply to local governments or charter revisions, but the law department advised us.
Diane, I would ask that you not ask a legal question in this open public meeting because I can't give you a privileged answer.
No, I'm just saying, we need to get an answer to that question.
I can't,
Point.
yes, and
Okay.
we're certainly talking to council.
If I could just make one more comment on the procurement issue. I think that part of the challenge is that we are not looking at the life cycle of a contract necessarily, or have not necessarily gotten testimony that looks at that. When we are talking to nonprofits, it's post-procurement where it becomes like a black hole. And I think that's the issue that we're trying to solve.
Yes.
Whether it's PPV or whether it's MOX. So more clarity to the extent that we can get testimony on what happens post-procurement and the challenges with managing the contract itself, I think would help clarify what we're.
Yeah, I
what we're
think that's a
trying to-
very helpful a point to make, that while PPP does have ostensible authority over this area, there's very little action it takes in the area of payment, and that is such a pain point that we've been focusing on in the report.
So I am, I want to, with no public testimony, I'll be damned if we go late. So, so I want to be cognizant of that. We have some business to do. And so I would say maybe if we have maybe 1 more minute of questions or direction for the staff.
No, thank you.
I want to thank the staff again. I think this has been very productive.
Yeah, thank you.
Preliminary report, and I found this to be a very productive conversation. Hopefully the staff has found it to be helpful in sort of directing towards next area of work. So we have a couple of things that we have to do. We have 2 motions in particular. One is that we need to improve the minutes of our Manhattan public hearing. If we need to approve, and I'm going to do it separately if it's okay. So can I have is there a second?
Second.
All right. Any questions, any comments? All in favor?
Aye.
All right, any
Aye.
opposed? All right, the motion carries. The second is a resolution, resolution number 4, which was circulated to the commissioners in advance to adopt this report, which is not to say, adopting the report does not mean, just to say that we adopt this report, which is really to say that this reflects the conversation, the testimony that we've heard. And the resolution also directs the staff to continue to move forward its research to get to final recommendations in the way that we've discussed.
Mhm.
One thing that's very important to me, but just part of the motion, is also to note that the preliminary report does not necessarily drive the bounds of what we might consider. Understanding that, again, based on our last conversation, we're not going to consider 40 things. I will say for me personally, there are other big areas of testimony that we heard that we have not addressed. I don't know if we'll get to them from a staff perspective or from a consensus perspective, but the motion also acknowledges that we can continue to hear about other items, even if they're not in the preliminary report. It also directs staff to prepare a final report, as well as specific ballot questions and abstracts that the commission will finally vote on. So questions, for example, Senator, like what is the actual process, which will be finalized, it will not be conceptual, it'll be a particular process. So with that all understood, is there a motion to adopt that resolution?
So moved.
Can I have a second?
Second.
Any questions, concerns? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Now I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second? Let's talk about that for 20 minutes. All in favor? All right, we are adjourned. Thank you all so much.
No.